You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Cole Merritt. I'm 43 years old, and I make my living taking pictures nobody asked for until they end up on the cover of some outdoors magazine. Home, for me, has been a moving target for about 6 years now. Wherever I park is where I wake up. I grew up in Beaumont, did a decade of oil field work before my knees gave out on the idea of a desk job. And somewhere along the way, picking up a camera turned into the only thing that felt like mine. I've got a habit most people find strange. I don't like staying in one place long enough to get comfortable. Comfortable is when you stop paying attention. I learned that the hard way once on a rig, when a routine day nearly wasn't. Ever since, I keep moving, keep my eyes open, and I don't ignore the small stuff, the sound that's a half second off, the silence that shouldn't be there. I came out of Sam Houston National Forest on assignment for a small regional magazine, wanting shots of the Lone Star hiking trail before the state expanded a logging lease nearby. Late April, and the piney woods are doing that thing they do. Heavy green, humid enough to fog a lens, cicadas going nonstop. I figured 4 or 5 days. Easy work, good light in the mornings. First thing that caught my eye wasn't scenery. It was a flyer stapled to the bulletin board at the trailhead parking lot, half curled from the humidity. A photo of a young woman, dark hair, easy smile. Reese Calloway, 29, graduate student, last seen 11 days back doing bird survey field work off one of the old logging spurs. The flyer looked tired already, like it had been rained on more than once. I'm not a guy who can see something like that and just keep walking. I did 2 seasons with a volunteer search and rescue outfit back when I still lived in one place. Mostly grid walking and radio work. Nothing heroic. It's not something I advertise, but it means when I see a missing person flyer, my brain doesn't file it away as background noise. It sticks. I swung by the ranger station before I even unpacked my gear. The ranger there, a heavy-set guy named Denny Kowalski, gave me the department line without much warmth. Search had scaled back after the first week. They figured she'd gotten turned around or hurt somewhere off trail. Dogs hadn't picked up much beyond a half mile from her camp. He said it the way you say something you've said 50 times already. I told him I used to do SAR work. Offered to help canvass a couple of the less traveled spurs while I was out shooting anyway. He shrugged like it wouldn't hurt. Gave me a photocopied section of trail map with her last known camp circled in pen, and told me not to expect much. I got the sense he wanted the whole thing over with. File forgotten. I spent that first afternoon on the main trail, getting my shots, telling myself I was just working. But somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker, I noticed something that needled at me. No birdsong. Not a distant one. For a force a grad student was out here, surveying birds in. That felt backwards, like walking into a kitchen and not smelling food. I made camp that night, close to the trail, told myself the quiet was just heat and season. Something scratched into the bark of a loblolly pine near my sight, caught my headlamp beam before I turned in. A crude shape, like antlers crossed over a blade. Maybe old, maybe not. I didn't think much of it then. I photographed it out of habit, same as everything else, and went asleep telling myself the woods were just doing what woods do. Morning came in gray and close, the kind of humidity that sits on your chest. I broke camp early and worked my way toward the spur where Reese's site had been. On the trail, I ran into an old-timer named Earl Vance, out walking a beagle that looked older than he did. He'd lived on the edge of the forest, he said, since before it was federal land in most people's memory. Earl was friendly enough at first, asked what I was shooting, told me a story about a black bear that used to raid his trash cans in the 80s. But when I mentioned I was heading toward the old logging roads west of the ridge, something in his face changed, subtle, like a door easing shut. He told me to stick to marked trail. Didn't explain it, just said it twice like repetition would do the convincing for him. I pushed, gently, the way you do with someone who clearly wants to keep talking despite themselves. Earl mentioned, almost like he regretted it as the words left him, that back in the 70s and 80s there had been private hunting leases out past the old spur roads, shut down decades back over some dispute with the Forest Service. He said people still whispered about them being out there, unofficial, waiting for the government to look elsewhere. I asked if he thought that had anything to do with Reese. He said he didn't know anything about that. Too quick, too flat, and called his dog before I could ask another question. I watched him go, feeling like I'd knocked on a door that had opened by accident rather than invitation. With the ranger's blessing, I checked Reese's abandoned camp that afternoon. Her tent was still up, sun-bleached, sagging. Her field notebook was still inside, water-damaged, but legible, full of careful sketches of warbler nests. What stuck with me wasn't what was there. It was how it was zipped, from the outside. Not something you do, leaving your own tent. Near a stake by the tent's corner, half buried in pine straw, I found the same symbol I'd seen the night before, carved fresh into a sapling. Antlers, blade, the line still pale where the bark had split. I photographed it next to my boot for scale, the way I'd been trained to document anything that might matter later, even if I couldn't say why it did yet. I brought what I'd found back to Denny at the station. He looked at the photos, nodded like he was humoring me, said kids carve all kinds of things out here. Could be from a Boy Scout troop for all he knew. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that the department was looking at closing the search out completely within the week. Manpower, budget, the usual math that turned a person into a line item. That didn't sit right with me. I told him I wanted to poke around the old logging roads on my own time. Off the books, no liability on him either way. He didn't argue much, just told me to carry a radio and stay reachable, the tone of someone checking a box rather than someone worried. I packed light that evening. Water, a headlamp, my camera, and a knife I hadn't carried on a hike in years. I hit the fire road just after dusk, following it roughly toward where Earl's directions had trailed off mid-sentence. Somewhere past the second gate, I heard an engine, ATV by the pitch of it, running without lights that I could see, moving fast then cutting off entirely. I stood there a long minute in the dark, waiting for it to start again. When it didn't, I kept walking, and that's when I found the tire tracks peeling off the fire road in a brush that no map I'd seen showed as a trail. The tracks were fresh, deep enough to hold water from the last rain, cutting through undergrowth that hadn't been cleared in a long time, except along that single narrow line. I followed them slow, keeping my headlamp low and red filtered, the way I used on search grids at night, so I wouldn't blow my night vision. The brush thickened fast, pine giving way to something closer to scrub, branches clawing at my sleeves. About 40 minutes in, the tracks led me to a gate, rail chain link, real rust, but the private property, no trespassing sign zip-tied to it looked laminated, recent, out of place against everything around it rotting quietly for decades. Government land doesn't usually get new signage from whoever wants it posted. This felt curated, deliberate, someone's own boundary drawn over federal ground. I climbed over rather than risk the gate creaking, and maybe 200 yards past it I found the first blind, an elevated hunting stand, the kind you'd use for deer, except this one was angled wrong. It wasn't facing any game trail I could see. It was aimed square down a footpath, the kind made by boots, not hooves, worn smooth enough that people had used it a lot. There was a second blind further on, same angle, same problem. I stood under a long moment doing math I didn't want to be doing, and once I did it, I couldn't undo it. Whatever these men had been hunting out here, it walked on two legs. Near the base of an old oak past the second blind, I found a line of items nailed at intervals along the trunk, weathered but intentional. A hiking boot, sun-bleached and stiff. A woman's wedding ring, thin gold, threaded onto a nail like a trophy tag. A driver's license, laminate cracked. The name and photo worn past reading, but the shape of a face still visible if you look too long. I counted 11 items before I stopped letting myself count. My hands did what 6 years of habit trained them to do before my head caught up. I raised the camera and started documenting, working fast, telling myself I was gathering evidence, not looking too hard at any one piece for more than a second. It's a strange kind of mercy, having a job that gives your hand something to do while the rest of you catches up to what you're looking at. Voices reached me before I saw anyone. 2 men, easy and unhurried, talking about needing to swap batteries on the cameras up top before the weekend. I dropped low into a stand of Yupon holly, camera against my chest, breath gone shallow and careful. They walked past in camo that wasn't hunting store camo, rifles slung casual as fishing rods, close enough that I could have named the brand of one man's boots. One of them stopped maybe 15 feet from me, said something to the other about a smell, sniffed at the air like a man checking weather. I kept still enough to feel my pulse in my teeth. He shrugged it off after a few seconds, said something about a dead hog somewhere, and they moved on, their voices fading into the tree line ahead. Once they'd gone, I followed their trail at a distance and found drag marks leading toward a low structure half buried under camouflage netting. A maintenance shed, or something built to look like one. Generator hum coming faint from somewhere beneath it. I didn't go closer. I'd seen enough to know I needed help bigger than me, and I turned back toward the gate, aware for the first time that my own boot prints were laid down clear as an invitation behind me. I was most of the way back to the gate when I heard it. Not voices, not an engine, something smaller. A tapping, uneven, coming from the direction of that shed rather than ahead of me. I stopped dead in the trail, every instinct built over years of moving on telling me to keep walking, and one stubborn piece of me refusing to let it go unchecked. I stood there working through it the way you'd work through a math problem you already knew the dangerous answer to. Leaving meant getting real help fast. Checking meant maybe finding whoever, whatever, was making that sound, and maybe not walking away from it clean. I told myself 2 minutes, no more, and turned back toward the shed against every reasonable instinct I had left. The shed's door was chained, but the corrugated siding had pulled loose at one corner, enough to see barrels, coiled rope, a rack of hunting gear that looked more tactical than sporting. In the far corner, a section of plywood flooring sat slightly raised, hinged, like it had been cut and reset more than once. The tapping was coming from underneath it. I pried the plywood up with my knife and found a storm cellar dug down into the clay, old enough to have been there before whoever built the shed on top of it. Reese was down there, curled against the dirt wall, wrists rope burned, blinking against even my dim red light like it was noon sun. She didn't scream. I think she'd learned somewhere in those 11 days that screaming didn't get her anything. Getting her out took longer than it should have. She was weak, dehydrated, one ankle swollen bad enough that standing on it made her go white. I got her arm over my shoulder and we moved slow, hugging the tree line instead of the trail, every twig snap sounding like a gunshot in my head. She kept apologizing for the pace, and I kept telling her to save her breath for walking instead. We were maybe 300 yards from the gate when a floodlight kicked on behind us. Motion triggered, catching us both flat in white light for one long second before I yanked her sideways into brush. Somewhere behind that light, a dog started up, and then a man's voice, sharp, calling to another. Whatever quiet window we'd had was gone. We ran as best as her ankle would allow. Cutting through terrain I'd scouted just enough of on the way in to have some edge over men following flashlights instead of memory. She stumbled twice, once hard enough to nearly go down a slope, and I caught her by the wrist rather than let her fall the last few feet toward where I could hear voices closing from the other side. At one point I peeled off deliberately, crashing loud through brush in the wrong direction to pull at least one set of footsteps away from her, doubling back a few minutes later once I'd bought enough distance. It wasn't smart, exactly, but it worked, and I've never been able to decide since whether that makes a mistake or not. We came together again at a shallow creek crossing, both of us soaked to the knee and breathing too loud for comfort. Somewhere behind us, an engine turned over, then another, headlights sweeping through trees a quarter-mile off. We didn't say anything. We just kept moving toward where I hoped the fire road still was. The dark ahead, no more promising than the dark behind, just further from what we knew was chasing us. We hit the fire road with less than a mile left of the trailhead, and I don't remember much of that stretch except the sound of our own feet and Reese's breathing going ragged and thin. Somewhere in there the adrenaline that had been carrying me started running out, and my legs turned into something I had to consciously operate rather than trust. Denny was still at the ranger station, working late on paperwork he probably hated, and the look on his face when we came through that door said more than anything he'd told me all week about how little he'd expected to see either of us again. He got on the radio before he even got Reese a chair, voice suddenly a lot less like a man filing a report. There was a stretch of time after that. EMTs, blankets, questions asked twice because nobody quite believed the answers the first time. That had its own kind of relief in it, small and human. Someone handing me a lukewarm coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world after what we'd just come out of. A team went back in 3 days later, once enough agencies had gotten involved to justify it. They found the shed, the cellar, the blinds. What they didn't find was anyone. No men, no rifles, no generator running. Whoever had been out there had cleared out fast and thorough, like they had practiced doing exactly that before. The official statement, when it came, called it the possible site of a rogue poaching operation, unconnected to any specific individuals, case open but inactive. Nobody used the word. I kept turning over in my own head. No arrest followed. Nobody local seemed especially surprised or especially curious, which unsettled me more than anything I'd seen in that clearing. Reese recovered, physically, over the following months. She wouldn't talk about the specifics of those 11 days. Not to me. Not, as far as I know, to investigators beyond what was strictly necessary. She moved states not long after. We exchanged a few messages, then didn't. I understood it. Some things don't survive being spoken about twice. I think about Earl sometimes, the way his face shut like a door at the mention of those old roads, and about Denny's easy dismissal of carved symbols as nothing worth his time. I don't know what either of them knew, if anything. I've stopped trying to build a theory out of two men's discomfort. Some questions don't get answers, just a shape where the answer should be. For months later, 3 states away, I found the same symbol. Antlers crossed over a blade, scratched faint into the paint near my back door. The kind of mark you'd only notice if you already knew to look for it. I never figured out when it got there, or by whose hand. I photographed it anyway, out of habit, and told myself it didn't mean anything. I still check my mirrors more than I used to. I still don't sleep as easy in quiet places as I did before that week in the piney woods. I don't know if that's paranoia earning its keep or something else entirely. And most nights, I've decided I'd rather not find out which. My name is Delphine Winship. I'm 45 years old, and I work as an independent hydrogeologist, which is a fancy way of saying I test water for a living and tell people things they usually don't want to hear about what's underneath their land. I've lived out of a converted cargo van for almost 4 years now, ever since a contract with a state agency turned into a full-time freelance career, and I realized I didn't need a fixed address to do any of it. Home, for me, is wherever the next well sample is waiting. I grew up outside Scranton in a family that had coal mining on both sides going back 3 generations. So old anthracite country isn't unfamiliar territory to me the way it might be to somebody coming in cold. I know what abandoned breaker towers look like rusting into a hillside, know the particular orange tint that mine drainage leaves in a creek bed, know enough history to understand why some of these hollows still carry names nobody bothered updating on modern maps. None of that made me any less unsettled by what I found this time. The job that brought me out to the Allegheny National Forest region was a private contract, testing well water for a cluster of rural properties whose owners had reported symptoms nobody could quite pin down: headaches, nausea, a metallic taste that lingered no matter how long they ran their taps. Late October, cold enough that my breath fogged most mornings. The whole forest gone the color of rust, and old pennies with the leaves mostly down and the light coming in low and slanted through bare branches. I noticed the flyer taped inside the door of the general store where I stopped for supplies my first morning in the area, curled at the corners from humidity, a young man's face looking out over dates that put him 3 weeks missing. Callum Fenwick, 26, local hiker, last seen heading toward an old strip mine access road with a fishing rod and a backpack. Never made it to the friend's house where he'd planned to stay that night. The search, according to a handwritten note stapled below, had been suspended after 10 days for lack of leads. I asked the clerk about it, a heavy-set woman who barely looked up from restocking a shelf, and she got tight-lipped fast in the particular way people do out here when a subject brushes up against something bigger than themselves. She told me the strip mine roads had a reputation going back to when the mines shut down in the 70s. Said folks avoided that whole stretch on account of animals coming out of there wrong, deformed, aggressive, more than the usual mutation you'd expect from any isolated population. I pushed a little further, and she mentioned, reluctant, that a hauling company had been running trucks up those access roads at odd hours for the better part of 2 years now. Official paperwork claiming reclamation work, though nobody local had ever actually seen anything get reclaimed. She said the creek running off that hillside had turned a color no creek ought to turn. Said her own nephew wouldn't fish it anymore after his dog got sick from wading in it. And then she busied herself at the shelf again like she'd already said more than she meant to. That first night, parked at a pull-off along the delivery route for my first scheduled well test, I caught a smell on the wind that didn't belong to any forest I'd ever camped in. Chemical, sharp, underlaid with something sulfurous that reminded me uncomfortably of the mine drainage samples I'd spent a career analyzing. I logged it out of professional habit, wrote down wind direction and approximate distance, and told myself I'd trace the source once daylight made that safer to attempt. I didn't sleep well. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately place. A low mechanical groan, distant but rhythmic, like heavy equipment idling somewhere. It had no business idling at that hour. I lay there working through explanations. A generator, a compressor, something entirely mundane. And none of them fully settled the unease sitting low in my chest, the kind of professional instinct that had kept me employed this long specifically because I'd learned not to ignore it. By the time actual dawn broke gray and close over the ridgeline, the smell had faded enough that I could almost convince myself I'd imagined its sharper edges, and the groaning equipment sound had stopped some time before I finally drifted into a thin, unsatisfying sleep. I made coffee, checked my sampling kit, and told myself the day's actual work. 3 properties, 6 wells, straightforward chemistry, would keep me too busy to keep chasing a smell and a sound that probably had nothing to do with a missing 26-year-old hiker anyway. The first well I tested that morning, on a property belonging to an elderly couple named the Osterhouts, came back with numbers that stopped me cold before I'd even packed up my equipment. Heavy metal concentrations, well beyond anything reclaimed mine drainage should produce naturally, along with trace compounds I recognized from industrial solvent testing rather than anything geological. I ran the sample twice, got the same disturbing numbers both times, and started rethinking everything the store clerk had mentioned about hauling trucks and reclamation paperwork. Mr. Osterhaus, 70-some years old and sharp despite his age, told me over coffee that the hauling trucks had started coming through maybe 2 years back, always at night. Always the same handful of drivers who never stopped in town or spoke to anyone beyond the bare minimum required for gate access. He said the company operating up there called itself a reclamation contractor on the signage, but that his late brother, who'd worked mine safety inspection for 3 decades, always said reclamation crews didn't usually need to work exclusively after dark. I asked if he'd ever reported his suspicions to anyone official. He laughed, short and without humor. Said he'd called the state environmental office twice over the past year, gotten a form letter both times thanking him for his concern and promising a site visit that, as far as he knew, had never actually happened. He said out here, far enough from anywhere anyone important lived, complaints tended to travel into a kind of bureaucratic silence that never quite resolved into either confirmation or denial. That afternoon, finishing up my second property's well tests, I mentioned Callum Fenwick's disappearance to a younger neighbor helping the Osterhouts with yard work, a wiry guy named Prentice Dahl who'd grown up in the area and clearly knew every back road better than any GPS. His face did something complicated at the mention of the name, and he told me, after a long pause, that he'd actually been part of the volunteer search effort during the first week, before the official search went down. Prentice said the search dogs had picked up Callum's scent trail heading directly toward the old strip mine access road before losing it entirely near the property line where those newer chain link fences started, fences that hadn't been there, by his estimation, more than 18 months. He said the search coordinator had wanted permission to extend the search onto that fence property, and that permission had somehow never come through before the whole effort got scaled back for budget reasons nobody explained clearly. I asked if he'd go back out there with me, off the record, just to look. He hesitated long enough that I thought he'd refuse outright, then agreed, quiet, on the condition we go at first light rather than risk the property's night activity that half the town apparently knew about and nobody official seemed willing to formally investigate. We arranged a meet before dawn, and I spent that evening reviewing my water samples again, cross-referencing contaminant signatures against every industrial solvent database I had accessed on my laptop. The pattern that emerged wasn't subtle once I knew what to look for. Concentrations increasing the closer a property sat to the strip mine road, a signature that matched, uncomfortably well, industrial waste disposal rather than anything related to legitimate mine reclamation chemistry. Whatever that hauling company was actually doing up there under cover of darkness and vague paperwork, it wasn't restoring the land. It was using old mine shafts as a dumping ground, and the Osterhout's water, along with God knew how many other properties, was slowly absorbing the consequences. I met Prentice before sunrise the next morning, both of us bundled against a cold that bit harder in the dark, and we hiked the strip mine access road together on foot, staying off the main gravel in favor of tree cover along its edge. About a mile in, We found the fence Prentice had mentioned, chain link, newer than everything surrounding it, a laminated no trespassing sign zip-tied at an angle that looked recently adjusted rather than weathered into permanence. Exactly the kind of curated boundary that has no business appearing on land the state still technically owned. We climbed the fence rather than risk the gate further down, both of us moving slow and low through undergrowth that thickened fast past the property line, scrub, oak, and briar tangling at our jackets in ways that made quiet movement increasingly difficult. The chemical smell I'd caught that first night grew stronger as we advanced, sharp enough now to sting the back of my throat, underlaid with something organic and wrong that neither of us wanted to name out loud before we actually understood its source. About half a mile past the fence, the tree cover opened onto a cleared area dominated by an old mine shaft entrance, reinforced with newer concrete and steel bracing than anything else on the property. A heavy equipment access ramp cut into the hillside beside it wide enough for the kind of hauling trucks Prentice had described. Drums stacked in irregular rows under tarps that had clearly been disturbed and rearranged many times sat in a staging area just outside the shaft mouth, several visibly leaking into soil, already stained a color no healthy ground should turn. Prentice went pale beside me, quiet in a way that told me whatever theoretical suspicion he'd carried into this hike had just become something considerably more concrete and considerably worse than he'd braced for. I started photographing everything methodically, professional habit overriding the unease building steadily in my chest, documenting drum labels, staging layout, the shaft's reinforced entrance, anything that might eventually matter to whoever finally investigated this properly. Near the shaft mouth, half obscured by one of the disturbed tarps, I found a backpack, forest green, weathered enough by exposure to have been there weeks rather than days. Prentice recognized it before I'd fully processed what I was looking at, said it matched exactly what Callum had been carrying the day he disappeared, his voice gone thin and unsteady in a way that told me he'd been holding out hope for an outcome we both now understood was considerably less likely than either of us wanted. Voices reached us then, unhurried, coming from deeper in the clearing near what looked like a maintenance trailer set back against the tree lean. Two men discussing something about a truck schedule in tones that suggested routine business rather than any awareness that they had company. We dropped low into brush at the clearing's edge, and I found myself cataloging exit routes with the same careful attention I usually reserve for reading water chemistry reports, aware that whatever this operation actually was, it clearly employed people willing to protect it by more than paperwork. One of the men carried a rifle slung casual across his back, the kind of easy familiarity that told me it wasn't for show, and something about the way he scanned the clearing's perimeter as he walked suggested a habit of checking for exactly the kind of intrusion Prentice and I currently represented. We stayed flat against the ground until they passed into the trailer, their conversation fading behind a door that clicked shut with more weight than a simple maintenance shed door should carry. Past the trailer, closer to the shaft entrance itself, I noticed a section of ground that had been disturbed and reseeded recently, grass growing in a rectangle too deliberate and too uniform to be natural regrowth, positioned at an angle that made my stomach turn once I let myself consider what that kind of careful concealment usually meant on a property already dumping toxic waste into abandoned mine workings under cover of night and false paperwork. I photographed that section too, hands steadier than I expected given how loud my pulse had gotten, and motioned to Prentice that we needed to leave before the men returned or others arrived on schedule. We backed out through the brush the way we'd come, moving faster now, less careful about noise than caution demanded, both of us driven by the same urgent need to get this evidence somewhere official before anyone realized exactly how much we'd already seen. We were nearly back to the fence when a voice behind us, calm and considerably closer than either of us had accounted for, told us both to stop moving and turn around slow, and I understood, facing a third man I hadn't clocked during our approach, that whatever quiet exit we'd been counting on had just stopped being available to either of us. The man behind us looked younger than the two we'd watched near the trailer, maybe 30, a pistol held with a steadiness that suggested training rather than nerves, though something in his expression read more uncertain than the weapon implied. He marched us both back toward the maintenance trailer rather than toward the fence line, radio crackling once against his hip with a burst of static neither of us could parse in actual words. Inside the trailer, An older man who introduced himself only as Hollis met us, with an unervingly businesslike calm. More accountant than criminal in his manner despite everything the clearing outside made obvious about what he was actually running. He explained, without much prompting, that the operation had started years back as legitimate reclamation contracting before quietly pivoting into cheaper, considerably less legal disposal work once the money in that direction proved impossible to ignore, and that the mine shafts made a disposal site nobody thought to check. I asked, as steady as I could manage, what had happened to Callum Fenwick. Hollis's expression shifted into something almost regretful. Said the kid had stumbled onto the staging area much the way we had, panicked when confronted, and things had gone wrong faster than anyone intended during the resulting struggle near the shaft entrance. He said it like an accident he genuinely regretted rather than something premeditated, which somehow made it land harder rather than easier to process. He gestured toward the disturbed, reseeded ground I'd photographed outside, confirming without quite saying it directly what that rectangle of two uniform grass actually represented, and I felt Prentice go rigid beside me as the full weight of what we'd stumbled into finally settled fully into both of us. Hollis said he took no particular pleasure in any of this, that the operation had simply grown too valuable to risk exposure over one unlucky hiker, and that he intended to handle our own situation with the same practical regret rather than any malice. They walked us to a storage room at the trailer's rear, secured with a deadbolt. Hollis worked himself with unhurried confidence, leaving us under guard of the younger man, while he presumably arranged whatever came next for two people who'd seen considerably more than his operation could afford to have witnessed. The younger guard fidgeted with his radio, nervous in a way his associates outside hadn't been, and I recognized in that nervousness something I might actually be able to work with given enough time and careful conversation. I started talking, quiet and steady, asking about his life, how he'd ended up working for someone like Hollis, whether this was really the future he'd imagined for himself before circumstances narrowed his options down to this. Prentice caught on fast, added details about the town, about people this young guard might still know and might not want discovering exactly what he'd become involved in, working the same angle from a different direction. It took the better part of an hour, but his attention slipped enough, distracted by a radio call from outside that pulled his focus toward the door, that I closed the distance and got a hand on his wrist before he fully registered what was happening. The struggle was brief and clumsy, ending with Prentice wrenching the pistol free while I held the guard pinned, both of us breathing hard in the sudden quiet that followed, aware we now had a very narrow window before Hollis or the others noticed anything wrong. We left the guard zip-tied with cable we found in a supply bin, took his radio, and moved fast through the trailer's rear door and a tree line beyond, putting distance between ourselves and the clearing before shouting confirmed what we already expected. Hollis had discovered the empty storage room considerably sooner than our head start accounted for. We ran the fence line hard, Prentice leading since he knew the terrain considerably better than I did, gunfire cracking once behind us, close enough to send bark spraying off a trunk just ahead of my shoulder. I put myself slightly behind him rather than beside him, some instinct insisting that positioning mattered, even though logic argued there wasn't really a safe position anywhere in the situation we'd landed in. We hit the fence and went over it faster than either of us had managed on the way in, adrenaline carrying us both well past whatever physical reserve should have run out an hour earlier. The Osterhout's property came into view sooner than my sense of distance had promised, and Prentice pounded on their door while I kept watch on the tree line behind us, both of us gasping out enough of an explanation that Mr. Osterhaus got his old hunting rifle down without asking a single clarifying question first. We called the state police from a landline rather than risk cell service the Hollow rarely carried reliably, and the response, once dispatchers understood what we were describing, came heavier and faster than I expected. County units first, state investigators, and, within hours, federal environmental enforcement agents trailing behind them for a case that had apparently been flagged internally before but never fully pursued for reasons nobody could immediately explain to us. A raid on the mine site that same afternoon found the staging area, the drums, the reinforced shaft entrance, and considerably more evidence than either Prentice or I had managed to document ourselves during our short, terrifying visit. They found Hollis and two others in custody within the day, though the younger guard we'd left zip-tied had somehow slipped away before authorities arrived, his current whereabouts still unresolved as far as either of us ever learned afterward. Recovery efforts at the reseeded rectangle of ground confirmed what none of us had wanted confirmed, and Callum Fenwick's family finally received an answer, however devastating, after weeks of uncertainty that I imagine felt considerably worse than even this outcome. I gave statements for the better part of 3 days. My water testing data, entered as evidence that helped establish a timeline investigators said would have taken considerably longer to piece together without it. The official statement, once regional news picked up the story, described an illegal hazardous waste disposal operation exploiting abandoned mine infrastructure. Multiple arrests made, contamination assessment ongoing across a dozen affected properties including, prominently, the Osterhout's well. Cleanup and remediation, officials said, would likely take years and considerable funding. Neither the state nor the responsible parties seemed eager to commit quickly. Prentice and I stayed in touch loosely after that. The kind of bond that forms fast under circumstances like ours and then settles into something quieter once the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. He told me once, months later, that he still couldn't hike that stretch of forest without his chest tightening, and I told him I understood completely, since I'd stopped taking contracts anywhere near old strip mine country without running considerably more background research first than I used to think necessary. I finished my original contract eventually, weeks later than scheduled, water samples from a dozen properties telling a story I wished I'd never had to document this thoroughly. I still test wells for a living, still live out of my van, still trust the numbers on a chemistry report more than most people's reassurances, and some nights, parked somewhere quiet, I still catch that same sharp, sulfur smell on the wind and find myself checking twice before I let myself believe it's only my imagination. My name is Ren Ashby. I'm 31, and until 3 years ago I was teaching high school biology in Poughkeepsie. Now I make my living writing field guides nobody reads, and taking on freelance ecological survey work whenever a grant needs an extra set of hands. Home is wherever the work takes me, which suited me fine after a divorce that left the house to him and the road to me. I don't scare easy, or didn't used to think I did. I spent 2 summers doing bat population surveys in abandoned mines across 3 states, crawling into places most people wouldn't walk past, let alone into. You get comfortable with dark, tight spaces when it's your job. You stop flinching at things that would send other people running. The job that brought me to the Catskills was a survey contract for a small conservation nonprofit, cataloging bat activity in the old bluestone quarries and iron working scattered through sundown wild forest, a chunk of state land most hikers skip in favor of the bigger name peaks nearby. Late September, cold enough at night to see my breath, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel loud. I've been out there 4 days when I found the flyer, not on a board but taped inside the composting outhouse near the trailhead, which told me somebody local had put it there rather than officials. A young man, 22, local kid, last seen headed toward the old mine workings 3 weeks back with a metal detector and a 6-pack, according to his friends. Search called off after 9 days. I asked around at the general store in the nearest hamlet, a place so small it didn't bother with a name on the sign. The woman behind the counter got tight-lipped fast, said the kid, Dax Holloway, everyone called him, had a habit of wandering off, implied without saying it outright that this wasn't the first time somebody young had gone into those old workings and come back different, or not at all. I pushed a little, the way you do when a stranger's discomfort feels like it's protecting something rather than just being private. She told me, reluctant, that the mines had a reputation going back generations. Miners in the 1870s reporting men driven half-mad underground. Work stopped more than once for reasons the company never explained in the official record. She said her grandmother used to call it the sickness in the rock, and refused to say more than that. That night, camped near one of the old quarry access roads, I heard something that didn't fit anything in my survey notes, a rhythmic knocking, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere below ground level, the kind of sound water makes against a pipe, except there was no plumbing anywhere near where I was parked. I told myself it was pipes anyway, or whined through old shaft housing, and made myself write it down instead of following it. I didn't sleep well. Somewhere around 3, the knocking stopped, replaced by something I liked even less, a voice, or something shaped like one, carrying up through the ventilation shaft near my sight, too faint to make out words, cadence all wrong for wind. I lay still until it stopped, and in the morning I told myself I'd imagine the words, if not the sound. Morning light made the whole thing feel smaller, the way it does. I chalked the voice up to exhaustion and bad acoustics and got back to work, mapping bat roosts across 3 of the smaller shaft entrances the nonprofit had flagged as priority. It was slow, careful work, checking each opening before I put a headlamp anywhere near it, out of respect for both the bats and my own neck. The 3rd shaft I checked that day had been sealed with a grate, newer than the surrounding stonework by decades, bolted rather than welded like someone wanted it removable. That struck me as strange enough to photograph for the survey report. Most closures out here were old CCC era work, not fresh hardware. I made a note to ask the district office about it, and moved on to the next site. I ran into an older man that afternoon, introduced himself as Garrett Voss, said he'd hunted these woods his whole life and knew them better than any map. He was friendly in the overly talkative way of someone starved for company, told me stories about the quarry's boom years, the company town that used to sit where Second Growth Forest stood now. But when I mentioned the graded shaft, he went quiet in a way that didn't match his chattiness up to that point. He told me, choosing words slow and careful, that some of the old families out here still believed something had gotten into the deep workings back before the mines closed for good in the 1920s. Not a person, not exactly, but something that mimicked people well enough to lure the curious deeper than they meant to go. He said it like a story he didn't believe, but wouldn't test either, and admitted his own father wouldn't go within a half-mile of that particular shaft. I asked, half joking, if that's what happened to Dax Holloway. Garrett's face didn't find the joke. He said Dax had gone looking for old mining relics to sell online, metal detector and all, same as a couple other kids over the years who'd gotten too curious about that grate. He said the grate used to be open. Somebody put it up after the last time somebody didn't come back. That night, I couldn't leave it alone. Professional caution losing out to plain human curiosity. I went back to the graded shaft with a stronger light and found the bolts loose enough to work by hand, recently handled despite the rust dressing meant to make it look undisturbed. Someone had been in and out of there since the grate went up, and not carelessly, deliberately, covering their tracks each time. I told myself I was documenting bad activity, nothing more, as I worked the grate open enough to slide my light and camera through. The shaft dropped at a shallow angle before leveling into a horizontal gallery, timber supports still standing after a century, air colder than it had any right to be given the mild night outside. Bat guano coated the floor in patches, real enough evidence to justify my presence to myself, if nobody else. About 60 feet in, my light caught fabric. A jacket, red, faded, snagged on a support beam at shoulder height like someone had brushed past it moving fast. I recognized it from the flyer's photo description before I let myself think too hard about what that meant. I photographed it in place, the way I'd trained myself to document anything, hands working faster than my nerve wanted to allow. Past the jacket, the gallery split into 2 smaller tunnels, one clearly reinforced more recently than the other with fresh timber that hadn't weathered like the rest. I stood at that fork a long moment, cold sweat under my collar despite the shaft's chill, and made the kind of decision I'd spend the rest of that week questioning. I went into the newer tunnel instead of turning back the way I'd come. The reinforced tunnel ran straighter than the old workings. Floor swept clear in a way natural erosion wouldn't explain, like someone maintained foot traffic through here regularly. My headlamp caught cable running along one wall, insulated, newer than anything else in a mine by decades. Wherever that cable led, someone was actively powering something down here, and it wasn't the state. I followed the cable maybe 200 feet before the tunnel opened into a chamber that stopped me flat. Shelving units, plastic bins, a generator humming low in one corner, and rows of what I recognized, after a second too long, as hydroponic growing equipment. Empty at the moment, but recently used, the smell of fertilizer still sharp in air that shouldn't have carried scent that well. It clicked into place faster than I wanted it to. Not a haunting, not a monster in the old miner stories, a grow operation, hidden inside abandoned workings nobody official checked anymore, probably running for years under cover of a reputation that kept curious hikers and even rangers from looking too close. The knocking, the voice I'd half convinced myself, I imagined, equipment noise, maybe someone talking on a radio, carried strange through old ventilation shafts. That realization should have made me feel safer. It didn't. A drug operation hidden this deep, this deliberately, meant someone with real motivation to keep it hidden, and Dax Holloway's red jacket snagged on a beam 60 feet back suggested exactly how far that motivation might extend. I killed my headlamp and stood in dark that pressed against my eyes like a physical weight, listening for anything that wasn't my own pulse. Voices reached me then, distant but coming closer, unhurried, the particular ease of people who believe themselves alone down here. I backed toward the tunnel mouth I'd come through, feeling along the wall rather than risk light, every scrape of my boot against stone sounding, in that silence, like a shout. I made it to the fork just as a light swept the chamber behind me, and I ducked into the older, unreinforced tunnel, moving fast and blind, trusting memory over sight. Something gave under my foot with a sound I didn't examine closely, and I kept moving, telling myself whatever it wasn't my problem right now, my only problem was distance. The older tunnel dead-ended sooner than I expected, into a chamber I hadn't surveyed, air thick with damp, and something organic I didn't want to name. My light, when I risked it again, caught a shape against the far wall that took a full 2 seconds to resolve into a person, seated, unmoving, wrists secured to a support beam with the same insulated cable running through the newer tunnel. It was Dax, alive, barely, blinking against my light like it was the first he'd seen in weeks. He didn't speak, not right away, just made a sound low in his throat that I understood before he found words. Not a warning about the men behind me, but about something he'd started saying about the tunnels themselves, about sounds and shapes he swore he'd seen in the dark stretches beyond where I stood, before the men had found him and dragged him back each time he tried to leave. I didn't have room in me, right, then to sort out how much of that was true, and how much was 3 weeks alone in the dark, reshaping his mind into something that could survive it. I cut what I could of the cable with my multi-tool, got an arm under him, and started moving us both back toward the grate, aware the whole time of light and voices somewhere behind us, closer now, no longer unhurried. Dax could barely stand, and the tunnel wasn't built for 2 people moving badly in the dark. I kept my light low, red filtered from habit, guiding us both by feel more than sight through a gallery I'd only walked once, memory thin and unreliable exactly when I needed it most. Behind us, voices sharpened into something like alarm, someone having found the cut cable, the empty space where Dax had been. We hit the fork and I chose the reinforced tunnel this time, gambling that speed mattered more than avoiding the men who used it, since it was shorter and led straight back to the grate. Dax stumbled twice, weight sagging hard against my shoulder, and both times some reserve I didn't know I'd got us upright and moving again before I let myself think about how close we'd come to going down. A shout behind us confirmed what I already knew. They were in the tunnel now, moving faster than we could manage with Dax's legs barely working under him. I did the math I didn't want to do about distance and speed and how much of it was actually in our favor, and didn't like the answer, so I stopped doing math and just moved. The grate came into view sooner than I'd hoped, moonlight cutting a pale seam around its edge from the night outside. I shoved Dax through first, ignoring the sound he made as the metal scraped his ribs, then squeezed through myself, hands shaking too hard to work the bolts back into any kind of lock behind us. It wouldn't have held them anyway. I just needed distance, not a fortress. We went downhill instead of toward the main trail, my instinct screaming that the obvious path was exactly where they'd expect us. Dax's weight against my side turned into something closer to dead drag with every step, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that scared me more than the men behind us, that I might have to choose between carrying him and both of us getting caught. A light swept the trees above the quarry rim, voices spreading out now, splitting up, the particular sound of men who knew this ground far better than I did. I pulled Dax into a depression between 2 boulders, both of us pressed flat, his breathing ragged enough that I put a hand over his mouth, gentle as I could manage, until the light passed, and moved on toward the old access road instead of down toward us. We waited longer than felt safe, until the voices thinned into distance, and then nothing at all, before I risked moving again, angling us away from every trail I'd used over the past 4 days, trusting terrain I'd only half mapped in my head from survey work that suddenly felt like the only useful thing I'd ever learned. We came out, hours later than it should have taken, at a fire tower access road I recognized from a topo map rather than personal experience. Legs and lungs both past the point of complaint. I got Dax sitting against the base of the tower, got my phone out, and found one bar of signal just strong enough to place a call that felt, in that moment, like the most important thing I'd ever done with a phone. The response, once it came fast, state police, then something quieter and more federal a few hours behind them. Agencies I hadn't expected showing up for what started as a missing hiker case. Dax went out by helicopter before the sun was fully up, dehydrated, malnourished, alive in a way that felt, standing there watching the rotor wash flatten the grass, like the only outcome that mattered. I gave my statement 3 times to 3 different people, the story sounding stranger with each retelling despite being, if anything, simpler than what I'd actually lived through. Nobody asked me about the voice I'd heard the first night, or the knocking, and I didn't offer it. Some things don't survive being spoken aloud to people writing on clipboards. A raid 2 days later found the grow operation exactly where I'd left it, generator still running, equipment abandoned mid-harvest like whoever ran it had left in the same hurry I had. They found no one. Cable cut where I'd cut it. Cots in a side chamber I hadn't explored. Evidence of an operation that had clearly been running for years without anyone official noticing or asking why that particular shaft stayed gated. The official statement, when the story finally made regional news, called it an illegal cultivation operation exploiting abandoned mine infrastructure. Investigation ongoing. No suspects named. Garrett Voss's stories about the sickness in the rock went unmentioned, filed away, I assumed, as local color rather than anything worth an investigator's time. Dax recovered slowly, physically faster than whatever else had happened to him down there. I visited him once at his aunt's place before I left the area, and he still wouldn't meet my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, wouldn't finish sentences about the deeper tunnels, the ones past where I'd found him, the ones he swore led further than any map showed, and held something that watched rather than waited. I finished my bat survey. Technically, though my report to the nonprofit left out considerably more than included. I told myself the missing details didn't matter for population counts, which was true, and also not the reason I left them out. Some things you keep to yourself, because saying them out loud makes them realer than you're ready for. I think about that fork in the tunnel sometimes, the older passage I didn't take the second time, and about the sound Dax made when he first tried to describe what he'd seen down there before the men found him each time. I've decided, mostly, that 3 weeks alone in the dark can make a mind manufacture things to survive the silence. And mostly, I believe that. I don't do mind surveys anymore. I took a job doing above-ground fieldwork instead, told a nonprofit it was a scheduling thing. Some nights, camp somewhere quiet. I still catch myself listening for a rhythm in the dark that has no business being there. And some nights, more than I like to admit, I think I still hear it. Faint, patient, keeping time with something that isn't a generator at all. My name is Odessa Klein. I'm 52, and I spent 26 years as a nurse in the Savannah hospital system before I burned out hard enough to walk away from it entirely. These days I do seasonal trail maintenance contracts for the Forest Service. Work that pays little and asks nothing of me emotionally, which after a career the opposite felt like the only kind of job I could stand. I've buried a husband and outlived 2 careers, and somewhere in there I stopped being afraid of much. Physical labor doesn't scare me. Solitude doesn't scare me. What used to scare me, back in the ER, was the particular quiet that came right before something went wrong, a monitor that hadn't alarmed yet, a patient's breathing changing half a second before anyone else noticed. I still trust that instinct more than most people trust their own eyes. The contract that brought me to Chattahoochee National Forest was routine, clearing blowdown along a stretch of the Duncan Ridge Trail after a rough spring storm season. Early October, the kind of cool mornings that make you grateful for coffee, and the kind of afternoons still warm enough to work in a t-shirt. I figured 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if the storm damage ran deep. The flyer was at the trailhead kiosk, laminated against weather, a man's face looking out from under a ball cap. Grano Say, 34, avid backpacker, last seen 8 days back attempting a section hike alone, expected to resupply and suches, and never showed. The search had wound down to occasional volunteer sweeps, according to a handwritten note stapled below the original flyer. I mentioned it to my contract supervisor, a wiry, tired-looking man named Purdy who ran maintenance crews across 3 counties and had clearly seen more of these flyers than he wanted to count. He said searches out here always wound down eventually. Said the ridge country swallowed people sometimes and gave nothing back. Said it with the flat resignation of a man who'd made peace with something he shouldn't have. I asked if that was normal, people just disappearing out here. He hesitated in a way that told me the honest answer wasn't the one he usually gave, then said this was maybe the 4th disappearance he could recall in 15 years along this same general stretch of ridge. Always solo hikers. Always this time of year. Always chalked up officially to bad footing and worse luck. That first night, camped near my worksite along the ridge, I woke twice to a sound I couldn't immediately place. Not an animal, not wind, something closer to a metal chime, faint and irregular, carried on air that had gone dead still. I told myself it was some hiker's wind chime hung wrong, or gear knocking against a tree, and made myself go back to sleep both times. The second time I woke, the chiming had stopped, replaced by something that raised the hair on my arms before my conscious mind caught up to why. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting pitched too low to make out words, drifting up from somewhere downridge. I lay still along while listening, your instincts telling me something was wrong, even though nothing about the sound was loud enough to justify the feeling. And eventually it faded, and I told myself I'd imagine the words in it. Work kept me busy through the next 2 days, clearing storm-felled hemlock off the trail with a crew of 2 younger guys who talked more about football than anything useful. I didn't mention the sounds. Some things you keep to yourself until you understand them better. A habit left over from years of not alarming patients before you had a diagnosis to give them. On the 3rd day, working alone on a spur section, I found something that stopped me mid-cut. A small cairn, deliberately built, sitting just off the main trail in a spot no trail marker indicated. Nothing unusual about cairns in hiking country, except this one had a strip of red cloth tied around its base, and when I nudged it apart out of simple curiosity, I found a woman's hair tied buried inside, sun-faded, clearly not new. I mentioned the cairn to Purdy that evening, mostly making conversation, and watched his face do the same thing it had done talking about the disappearances, a kind of practiced blankness. He told me, after a pause too long to be casual, that some folks around such as believe the ridge had old ties to something predating the forest itself, groups that used to gather out past the fire roads for reasons nobody in town discussed directly. He said his own grandfather used to warn him off certain hollows growing up, called them the singing places, said you'd hear something on the wind out there that wasn't wind, and if you were smart, you'd already be walking the other direction before you finished wondering what it was. He told it like a story he'd heard too many times to fully dismiss, and too many times to fully believe either. I asked, careful, if he thought that had anything to do with Grand Osei or the others before him. Purdy's answer was a shrug that carried more weight than words would have, and a suggestion, firm enough to feel like advice rather than opinion, that I stick close to the main trail corridor for the rest of my contract and leave the exploring to people paid more than either of us to do it. That advice lasted about a day. The following afternoon, finishing up a section near where I'd heard the humming 2 nights before, I found a second cairn, same red cloth, and beside it, a boot print pressed into softer ground, adult-sized, days old by the crumbling of its edges, heading off-trail into a hollow gnome map I'd seen showed as accessible. I told myself I was simply curious about trail conditions, the same lie I imagine everyone tells themselves right before doing something they know better than to do. I followed the print maybe a quarter mile down into the hollow, terrain dropping steeper than expected, hemlock giving way to a stand of old-growth oak that felt older than the rest of the forest around it, air noticeably cooler, unnaturally still. The print stopped at a rock outcropping, natural looking at a glance, except for a section that had clearly been worked by hand at some point, flat stones arranged too deliberately to be erosion, forming something between a threshold and an altar, cold ash scattered across its surface despite no recent rain to explain the ash surviving out here otherwise. Past the outcropping, half hidden under leaf litter, I found a backpack, forest green, straps chewed by weather rather than animal, a name tag still zip-tied to the top loop. Grand Osei. I crouched there a long moment, nurse instincts running through everything that could mean None of the possibilities comforting before I made myself photograph it in place and back out the way I'd come, more careful with my footing than I'd been going in. I brought the photos to the ranger station the next morning, along with the coordinates I'd marked, and watched a young ranger named Casey Whitfield go pale in a way that told me she recognized the location before I finished explaining it. She made a call, spoke low enough I couldn't follow it, and told me a proper team would go out within the day, thanked me with the particular stiffness of someone trying not to show she was rattled. I should have left it there. I told myself I would, packed up my gear that evening with every intention of driving into Such's for a hot meal and letting people better equipped handle whatever came next. But something about that altered outcropping, the cold ash, the deliberate stones, kept working at me the way an unexplained symptom used to, refusing to let me file it away as someone else's problem. Against every reasonable instinct, I hiked back toward the hollow that night instead, telling myself I only meant to confirm the coordinates were accurate for the search team, nothing more. The humming started again before I'd gone half a mile, closer this time, low enough to feel in my chest more than hear with my ears, and threaded through it now, something that might have been voices, might have been wind through Hollowwood, might have been neither. I followed the sound rather than fleeing it, a decision I spent the rest of that night questioning, and found the source not at the outcropping, but beyond it, deeper into the hollow than I'd gone before. A gathering, maybe a dozen figures, robed in dark cloth, arranged in a loose circle around a fire burned low enough to throw more shadow than light. They're chanting unhurried, unbothered, like men and women who'd done this so many times it had worn smooth as river stone. I dropped flat behind a fallen trunk. Her going hard enough, I was sure it would give me away. From that angle, I could make out a second person at the circle's center, upright but unmoving, wrist bound in front of him, head bowed in a way that could have meant unconsciousness or could have meant something worse. And even at that distance, in that poor light, I recognized enough of him from the flyer's photo to know it was Grant. The chanting shifted register, rose in pitch, and the figures began moving, slow and deliberate, circling the bound man in a pattern that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The kind of ritual worn in a muscle memory over years rather than improvised for an audience of one terrified nurse hiding in the dark. I understood, watching it, that whatever waited at the end of that pattern, I had maybe minutes to do something before it arrived. I didn't have a plan beyond the one thing 26 years of emergency medicine had trained into me harder than fear ever could. You don't leave a patient behind if there's any window left to act. I circled wide through the dark, putting the fire and the gathered figures between myself and Grant's exposed side, moving slower than I wanted to, testing each footfall before committing weight to it. I got close enough to see his chest still rising, shallow but present, and close enough to hear one of the robed figures begin something that sounded less like chanting and more like a name, drawn out over several breaths, the rest of the circle answering it back in unison. Whatever was about to happen, the rhythm of it told me it was building toward a conclusion, and I was almost out of time to interrupt it before it arrived. I moved on the only advantage I had, which was that none of them expected an interruption from outside their own ritual. I came up behind Grant fast, low, cutting the rope at his wrist with a folding knife I carried since my ER days for reasons that had never once, until now, involved anything like this. He came awake with a jolt and a sound I muffled with my hand before it could carry. The chanting broke almost immediately, replaced by shouts, robed figures scattering from their circle formation into something faster and less orderly, several of them already moving toward where Grant and I crouched. I hauled him upright, his legs unsteady beneath him, and we ran the only direction that made sense, away from the fire and in a darker ground beyond it, branches raking at both of us as we went. Grant found enough strength somewhere to half run alongside me, rather than be dragged. Adrenaline doing for him what days of captivity clearly hadn't allowed. Behind us, the shouting organized into something more coordinated, flashlight beams, sweeping trees in patterns that suggested people who knew this ground far better than either of us running blind through it. I made a call I wasn't sure was right even as I made it, angling us away from the direction of the ranger station, reasoning that it was also the direction they'd expect us to run, and instead pushing us deeper along the ridge toward a fire tower I'd noted on a map days earlier, without any idea I'd need it as an escape route. Grant didn't argue, too focused on breathing to question my logic. A light swept close enough that I felt more than saw it graze the trees just above us, and I pulled Grant down hard behind a boulder. Both of us pressed flat, his breath ragged enough against my shoulder that I worried it alone might give us away. The light passed, voices with it, moving in the wrong direction for one long, suspended moment before a second set of voices, further off, suggested the group had split to cover more ground. We waited longer than instinct wanted, until the voices thinned into distance, before moving again, slower now, more careful. My ER training kicking in enough to notice Grant's breathing had gone shallow and fast in a way that worried me more than the men hunting us did. I talked him through slowing it, quiet instructions meant to keep both his lungs and his nerve intact for however much further we had to go. The fire tower access road appeared out of the dark later than my estimate had promised. Legs and lungs on both of us past the point of easy complaint. I got Grant seated at the tower's base, checked his pulse out of habit more than necessity, and pulled my phone out, finding one bar of signal just strong enough to place the call that mattered more than anything else I'd done that night. We waited there together in the cold, Grant drifting in and out of something between sleep and shock, until headlights finally swept the access road below us, and I stood to flag them down, aware for the first time since cutting his ropes free that my hands hadn't stopped shaking the entire way out. The response came heavier than I expected. County sheriff's deputies first, state investigators trailing a few hours behind, questions that multiplied faster than answers for most of that first night. Grant went out by ambulance before sunrise, dehydrated and shaken, but alive, which felt, watching those doors close, like the only outcome that had ever really mattered. I gave my statement more times than I could easily count, the story sounding stranger with each telling despite being simpler, in some ways, than what I'd actually lived through. Investigators pressed hard on the ritual details, the robes, the chanting, clearly working to build something they could prosecute rather than something they fully understood. A search of the hollow 2 days later found the outcropping, the cold ash, scattered signs of long use, but no people, no robes, nothing beyond physical evidence that something had gathered there repeatedly over what forensics eventually guessed was years, maybe longer. Whoever had been part of that circle had vanished as completely as they'd apparently done after each previous disappearance. The official statement, once it reached local news, called it evidence of a fringe group operating illegally on federal land. Investigation ongoing, no individuals identified or charged. Purdy's stories about the singing places and his grandfather's old warnings went unmentioned in any official capacity, filed away, I assumed, as folklore unworthy of a case file. Grant recovered slowly, spoke to me once more before he left the area for good, thanked me in a voice still hollowed out by whatever those days in the hollow had done to him beyond the physical. He wouldn't describe the chanting in detail, wouldn't say what name they'd been calling toward the end. I didn't press him for it, understanding by then that some things don't get lighter by being spoken aloud. I finished my contract, technically, though the report I filed left out considerably more than the coordinates in the backpack. I told myself the omissions didn't matter for trail maintenance purposes, which was true, and also not the whole reason I made them. 26 years of nursing taught me some things are better carried quietly than handed to people who will only ask questions they can't handle the answers to. I think sometimes about the 4 disappearances Purdy mentioned that first week, the pattern he'd noticed and never reported, and about how easily a place can earn a reputation for swallowing people while everyone around it agrees. Unspoken, not to look too closely at why. I've stopped trying to explain the humming I heard those first nights before I understood its source. Some sounds don't need an explanation once you know what came after them. I don't take solo contracts in ridge country anymore. Tell the Forest Service it's a preference rather than admit the real reason. Some nights, wherever I've parked, I still catch myself listening for a rhythm in the wind that has no business being there, half convinced, more nights than I'd like to admit, that some places keep singing long after the people who did the singing are gone. My name is Foster Langtree. I'm 28, and I install and repair cell tower equipment for a regional contractor, which means I spend half my life climbing steel in places most people never think about, and the other half driving between them in whatever vehicle I've managed to keep running. I grew up in Asheville, left for a decade, came back when the work did. Heights don't bother me. Never have. What bothers me, and always has, is not knowing what's below me when I'm up there. A habit left over from fall I took at 22 that should have killed me and didn't, for a reason the surgeon later called luck rather than skill. Since then I check things twice. I don't ignore small wrongness. I've learned it's cheaper than ignoring it and being wrong. Work brought me out to a tower site near Pisgah National Forest, deep enough in that the access road wasn't much more than old logging grade, gated a mile before the site itself. Late October, cold enough at elevation that frost held on the windshield past 9 most mornings. Leaves mostly down, the whole forest gone quiet in that particular way it does right before real winter sets in. I noticed the flyer at a gas station in the last town before the gate, taped inside next to a lottery display like it had been there a while, without anyone thinking to move it. A woman's face, mid-30s, camping alone according to the text. Last seen near a dispersed site, off the same forest road I'd be using for the next several days. Search suspended after 2 weeks, the flyer said, in smaller print like an apology. I asked the guy behind the counter about it, more out of habit than real curiosity. He got quieter than the question should have warranted. Said her name was Marisol Vance. Said she wasn't the first person to go missing off that particular stretch of road over the years. Said it in a tone that suggested he'd rather not be the one telling me that. I pushed a little, and he mentioned, reluctant, that locals had a name for that section of forest, the Hollow Mile, on account of some story about sound carrying wrong through it, voices that seemed to call from directions that didn't match where anyone was standing. He said it like a story his father told him, the kind you repeat without fully committing to believing. That night, parked near the gate waiting on paperwork clearance to reach the actual site the next morning, I heard something that snagged my attention harder than it should have. A voice distant, calling a name I didn't recognize, coming from what sounded like directly behind my rig. I stepped out, found nothing, found the sound now seeming to come from ahead instead, and told myself sound plays tricks in mountain terrain, which is true, and didn't feel like enough of an explanation even as I told myself it. I didn't sleep well. Around 2, the calling started again, closer this time, and something about the cadence, not quite right, syllables stretched wrong, like a recording slowed down partway, kept me lying rigid until it stopped on its own, well before dawn. Daylight helped, the way it usually does. I made it through the gate and out to the tower site by mid-morning. Spent the day doing the actual job I'd come for, which involved enough technical focus that the previous night's unease faded into background noise I could mostly ignore. I told myself exhaustion and unfamiliar terrain accounted for the rest. I ran into a maintenance worker from the power co-op that afternoon, an older guy named Dessel Foy who served this whole district and clearly knew every mile of it better than any map could. He was easy to talk to, told me stories about black bear encounters and a couple of gnarly winter rescues. But when I mentioned the Hollow Mile by name, something shifted in how he held himself. He confirmed the nickname, said his own uncle had gone missing off that stretch back in the 80s, never found, case gone cold decades ago. He said people around here mostly stopped hiking that section alone after enough disappearances stacked up over the years, though nobody official had ever connected them into anything more than isolated accidents or wandering. I asked if he thought Marisol Vance's disappearance fit that pattern. He said he didn't know. Too fast, the same reflexive deflection I'd started recognizing as its own kind of answer. But he added, unprompted, that anyone who spent real time out there eventually reported the same thing. Voices calling names, seeming to come from wrong directions, leading people who chased the sound further off trail than they meant to go. That evening, finishing up equipment checks before dark, I noticed something on the access road that didn't belong there. Fresh tire tracks branching off the main grade into brush thick enough that no casual driver would risk it. Tracks that led, when I followed them a short distance on foot, toward what looked like a deliberately cleared turnaround, screened from the road by low-hanging rhododendron. I found a single boot near the turnaround's edge, women's, sun-faded just enough to suggest weeks rather than days out in weather. I photographed it where it lay, professional habit from documenting equipment problems translating easily enough into documenting something considerably worse, and marked the coordinates on my phone before backing out the way I'd come. I reported it to the ranger station the next morning, along with what Dessel had told me. The ranger who took my statement, a young guy clearly new to the district, said he'd log it, promised the team would check the coordinates, but something in his manner suggested the case had already settled into the category of things unlikely to get solved regardless of new evidence. That didn't sit right with me. Against the better judgment of a guy who'd broken his back, once already trusting his own risk assessment, I decided to walk the turnaround and its surrounding brush myself before heading back to finish the tower job, telling myself I only meant to look, not to actually follow anything the forest offered up. The brush past the turnaround thinned into a footpath after a few hundred feet, worn enough to suggest regular use despite showing on no map I checked. I followed it slow, phone light low, watching for the same wrongness Dessel had described without any real plan for what I'd do if I found it. The temperature dropped noticeably as the path descended, cold pooling and low ground the way it does in mountain hollows this time of year. The calling started again about 10 minutes in, close enough this time that I nearly answered before catching myself. A name, drawn out, familiar sounding in a way that took me a full minute of unsettled walking to place. My own name, spoken in a register that wasn't quite my mother's voice and wasn't quite anyone else's either, coming from somewhere off to my left where the path didn't lead. I kept to the path. Every ounce of the caution that fall at 22 had beaten into me screamed against chasing a voice calling my own name through unfamiliar brush. And for once I listened to it fully. The voice tried twice more, shifting direction each time in a way that confirmed nothing about it was natural, before falling silent as the path opened into a shallow clearing. The clearing held the remains of a camp, tent collapsed and weathered, gear scattered like it had been searched rather than simply abandoned. A backpack near the tent's collapsed frame carried a name tag I recognized from the flyer. Marisol Vance. I stood there a long moment working through what that meant, professional instinct pushing me to document everything, even as personal instinct pushed just as hard to leave. I photographed the site the way I'd photograph a compromised tower, methodical, thorough, hands moving faster than my nerve wanted to allow. Near the tent, half buried under leaf litter, I found a section of cable, thin, insulated, running off into the brush in a direction that had nothing to do with any camp equipment I recognized. I followed the cable a short distance, curiosity overriding the caution I'd managed until then, and found it leading to a rock face further down the hollow, a section of which looked subtly wrong, too regular, too deliberately arranged, until I got close enough to recognize a door, camouflaged with care, built into what looked from any distance like natural stone. Behind the door, faint but audible, came sound that explained the calling voice with an unpleasantness I hadn't anticipated. Recorded audio, looping, a woman's voice repeating names in a slow, distorted cadence, clearly designed to lure anyone following it deeper into the hollow away from the main trail. Underneath the recording, fainter, came something else, a generator hum, and beneath that, movement. I backed away from the door slow, every instinct I'd screaming that whatever waited behind it wasn't something I could handle alone, and that's when a voice behind me, real this time, unmistakably human and considerably closer than I wanted, told me to turn around slow and keep my hands where he could see them. The man behind me was maybe 60, weathered in a way that spoke to decades outdoors rather than any recent hardship. Rifle held loose, but ready in a way that told me he'd held one plenty of times before. He didn't look surprised to find me there, more resigned, like I'd interrupted a routine rather than discover a secret. He walked me at gunpoint toward the hidden door, talking the whole way in a conversational tone that unsettled me more than shouting would have. Said his family had used this hollow for generations. Said the recordings were his grandfather's idea originally, back when it was easier to lure the curious away from a moonshine operation than chase them off directly. Said the operation had evolved since then into something he didn't specify, and didn't need to. Behind the door, the space opened into a series of chambers cut and reinforced over what looked like decades. Equipment for something I recognized uneasily as a methamphetamine operation, larger and more established than anything I'd expect this deep in protected forest. In a side chamber, secured to a support post, I found Marisol, alive, thinner than her flyer photo, eyes taking a long moment to focus on me like she'd stopped expecting anyone to come. The old man left me under guard of a younger relative, maybe 30, nervous in a way his uncle wasn't, while he dealt with something elsewhere in the chamber system. I watched that nervousness, recognized in it the same kind of person who breaks under sustained pressure rather than confrontation, and started talking quiet and steady, the way you'd talk down anyone mid-crisis, asking questions about his family, his uncle, anything that wasn't the situation directly in front of him. It took longer than I'd have liked, but his attention slipped enough, just once checking something on a handheld radio, that I closed the distance and got a hand on a rifle before he fully registered what was happening. The struggle was short and ugly, ending with him on the ground, and me holding a weapon I'd never in my life expected to need, hands shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped it twice, getting to Marisol. I cut her loose, got an arm under her, and we moved fast through chambers I hadn't mapped, guessing a direction more than knowing it, until daylight showed through what turned out to be a second, cruder exit further down the hollow. Shouting started behind us almost immediately, the old man's voice among it, considerably less conversational now than it had been minutes earlier. We ran the slope hard, Marisol weak, but adrenaline carrying her further than her body should have allowed. Gunfire cracking somewhere behind us, close enough to send bark spraying off a trunk just ahead of me. I put myself slightly behind her rather than beside her, some instinct insisting that was the smarter position, even as logic argued there wasn't really a smart position in any of this. We hit the access road considerably faster than I'd covered on the way in, both of us past any reserve of breath or strength, and I got Marisol into my truck cab, gunned the engine, and put distance between us and the hollow before either of us managed to say a single coherent word to each other about what had just happened. I drove straight to the ranger station, hands still not fully steady on the wheel, and the same young ranger who'd taken my report the day before came out to a scene considerably more dramatic than anything his training had likely prepared him for. Calls went out fast after that. County, state, federal agencies arriving within hours for what had started as a routine missing person case. Marisol went by ambulance to a hospital in Asheville, dehydrated and shaken, but stable, which felt, watching those doors close, like the only outcome that had ever actually mattered through the whole ordeal. I gave statements for the better part of 2 days, the story sounding less believable with each retelling despite being, if anything, simpler than what I'd actually lived through. A raid on the hollow that same night found the chamber system, the equipment, evidence of an operation running considerably longer than anyone had suspected. They found the old man, the younger relative I disarmed, 2 others besides, all in custody within the week, an outcome rare enough for this kind of case that even the state investigators seemed mildly surprised by it. The official statement, once local news picked it up, described a multi-generational methamphetamine operation exploiting remote forest terrain, several arrests made, investigation ongoing into the full scope and timeline. Dessel's stories about the Hollow Mile went unmentioned in anything official, filed away. I assumed, as folklore that had, this once, turned out to have an origin considerably more concrete than anyone expected. Marisol recovered over the following months, reached out once to thank me before mostly going quiet, the way people do when they'd rather not be reminded of the person who witnessed them at their worst. I understood it. I didn't push for more contact than she offered. I finished the tower job eventually, weeks later than scheduled, and told my contractor the delay was permitting issues rather than admit the real reason. I think sometimes about the recorded voice calling my name that first afternoon, how close I came to answering it, and about how easily curiosity could have walked me straight through that hidden door on someone else's terms instead of my own. I still do tower work in the Pisgah district when contracts call for it, though I stick closer to established roads than I used to, and I still catch myself, more nights than I'd like to admit, listening hard against the dark for a voice that has no business calling my name from ground I know, for a fact, is empty. Emlyn Prosser, 36 years old. I run a mobile veterinary practice out of a converted step van, mostly barn calls and low-cost spay-neuter clinics for folks scattered across the hollows who can't afford to drive 2 hours to a clinic. I grew up outside Knoxville, went to vet school in Georgia, and came home 8 years ago when my father got sick, then just never stopped moving once he passed. The van felt less like a compromise and more like the only shape my life still fit. I hum when I'm nervous, old bluegrass my grandmother used to sing, half under my breath, without noticing until somebody points it out. It's a tell I've never managed to break, same as the way small and closed spaces still tighten something in my chest, since a car wreck in my 20s left me pinned for 40 minutes waiting on the jaws of life. I mention it because it matters later. I notice ceilings. I notice exits. It's kept me steadier than most people in situations that should have rattled me apart. The circuit that brought me into Unicoi County this time ran through the Roan Highlands. Clinics scheduled at 3 farms scattered along the edge of Cherokee National Forest. Land that climbs fast into balds, and spruce fir forest cold enough in October to frost the grass by 7 each morning. I like this stretch of mountain. It's less photographed than the Smokies proper, quieter, the kind of place that still keeps its own secrets instead of selling them on postcards. The flyer was tacked to a community board outside a feed store in Hampton, weighted down with a thumbtack that had gone half-rusted in the damp. Journey Aldrich, 27, through hiking the Appalachian Trail southbound. Last confirmed near the Overmountain Shelter 3 weeks prior. Gear and pack never recovered. Search suspended, the flyer noted, pending any new information, which is the kind of sentence that means nobody expects any to arrive. I asked the feed store owner, a stocky man named Purvis, who'd clearly fielded the question plenty already, and he told me flatly that the Roan had swallowed more than one hiker over the years. Said it like a fact of local geography rather than anything worth alarm. When I pushed, he mentioned something stranger, almost as an afterthought. That bear sightings had dropped off hard the last 2 seasons. That hunters were coming back from these ridges, empty-handed in a range that used to be thick with black bear. That struck a professional nerve harder than the missing hiker had. I've treated enough wildlife rehab cases to know a healthy bear population doesn't just quietly thin out without a reason attached to it. I asked if anyone had reported carcasses, disease, anything official. He shrugged, said folks mostly just noticed the woods had gone quieter than they remembered, the way you notice an ache before you can name what caused it. That first night, parked at pull-off near Iron Mountain Gap ahead of my morning clinic, I heard something that didn't belong to any forest soundscape I knew. 2 gunshots, spaced maybe 90 seconds apart, followed by nothing at all. Not even the usual scatter of birds you'd expect startled from roost. Hunting season hadn't opened yet. I logged the time out of habit, the same reflex that makes me chart symptoms before I let myself guess at a diagnosis. I didn't sleep well after that. Somewhere close to 2 in the morning, an engine passed on the gravel spur below my pull-off, moving slow, no headlights that I could see through my back window, gone before I'd worked up the nerve to look properly. I told myself poachers ran dark like that sometimes, which was true, and true didn't make it sit any easier against the quiet climbing back and behind the engine's fade. Morning clinic kept me busy past noon, 40-some barn cats and a couple of hunting dogs lined up outside a pole barn while I worked through the queue with my tech. A college kid named Oaks who helped me 2 seasons a year for gas money and the experience. Between patients, I mentioned the gunshots and the dark running engine, mostly to have something to say besides suture counts, and Oaks went quieter than the subject should have warranted for a summer hire. He told me his uncle ran a wildlife rehab operation a few miles further up, an older woman named Cass Ruggles who'd been rehabbing black bear cubs and injured raptors on that land for 3 decades, and that she'd been raising hell with the state wildlife agency for the better part of a year about poaching activity she couldn't get anyone to take seriously. He gave me her address like he half regretted it, said she'd talk my ear off if I let her, but that I should probably hear what she had to say anyway. I found Cass that evening at a sprawling, ramshackle property backed against forest, 3 bear enclosures visible from the drive, only one of them currently occupied. She was maybe 65, sharp-eyed, missing part of one finger to what she explained without prompting had been a rehab bear mishap decades back. She'd lost 2 release-ready bears to poachers in the past year alone, she said, found gutted, paws and gallbladders taken, carcasses left to rot rather than fully removed. She explained, patient with a stranger's ignorance the way I imagine I get with pet owners who've never heard of heartworm prevention, that bear gallbladder and paws carried serious money on black markets tied to certain traditional medicine trades overseas, that a single gallbladder could fetch thousands. That organized poaching rings have been documented working these exact mountains for years without enough enforcement manpower to slow them down meaningfully. I asked if she thought that connected to Journey Aldrich's disappearance. Her face did something careful, like a woman deciding how much to hand a stranger she'd known 2 hours. She said through hikers sometimes wandered off trail chasing a view or a water source and stumbled straight into bait sites poachers set deep in the backcountry, sites nobody official checked, because nobody official believed poaching operations ran organized enough to need hiding from in the first place. She mentioned a specific stretch, an old iron mining tract along Buck Mountain that had gone through private hands twice since the mines closed in the 50s, still riddled with added tunnels nobody had properly sealed. She said her own trail cameras, placed to monitor bear movement for a state-funded study, had started returning blank memory cards or cameras gone missing entirely whenever she set them anywhere near that track's boundary. That got my attention in a way the gunfire hadn't quite managed alone. Cameras don't fail like that by accident. Not repeatedly, not in a pattern specific to one piece of ground. I asked if she'd reported the missing equipment. She had, more than once, and gotten the same tired non-answer everyone else in this story seemed to get from anybody with a badge, logged, noted, no follow-up that ever reached her ears. I told her I had 2 more days of clinic scheduled in the area and asked, half against my better judgment, whether she'd walk me along that boundary if I came back once my work was done. She agreed faster than I expected. Said she'd been wanting an excuse and a witness both. Said 2 people noticing the same thing carried more weight than one woman the agency had already filed under difficult and overly persistent. That night, back in my own pull-off, I found something on my step van's back bumper that hadn't been there that morning. A smear of something dark dried that turned out under my headlamp to be blood. Not mine, not fresh, pressed there like a handprint dragged sideways rather than left by accident. I photographed it, professional habit translating easily into documenting something considerably outside my usual scope of practice, and didn't sleep at all after that. Cass met me 2 days later at first light, both of us dressed for cold that hadn't fully lifted off the ridge yet, her carrying a bolt-action rifle slung with the unbothered familiarity of someone who'd hauled tranquilizer guns in the backcountry for 30 years. We hiked in from a legal access point rather than trespass directly, working the boundary of the old mining tract on foot, checking camera mounts as we went, 3 of the 4 turning up empty housings, wiring cut clean rather than simply failed. The 4th camera, tucked higher on a ridge spur than the others, had somehow survived, and Cass pulled its card right there in the field, plugging it into a handheld viewer she carried for exactly this purpose. Most of the footage was routine: deer, a bobcat, wind shaking the mount loose once during a storm. But 3 nights back, timestamp just after midnight, the frame caught 2 men working a game cart loaded with something wrapped in tarp, moving along a footpath that led deeper into the tract rather than out toward any legal road. Cass went still watching it, her jaw working, and told me flat that whatever was on that cart moved with the wrong kind of weight and shape for it to be deer or hog. Said 30 years of watching animals get loaded onto carts had taught her the difference in silhouette better than she wished it had. Neither of us said the word out loud yet. We didn't need to. The footage did that work for us well enough. We followed the footpath the camera had captured, staying off it slightly, working parallel through undergrowth thick with rhododendron that scraped and dragged at every layer we wore. About a mile in, the ground opened into a clearing dominated by an old mine adit, timbered entrance sagging, but reinforced in places with newer lumber. A game trail camera of its own mounted just inside the opening, aimed outward at anyone who might approach the way we just had. Near the adit's mouth, half buried under leaf litter and clearly disturbed by scavengers, we found bear remains, 3 animals by Cass's quick count, paws and gallbladders removed with a precision that told her whoever did this had done it enough times to know exactly what commanded a price and what didn't matter enough to bother taking. She crouched there a long moment, hand pressed flat to the ground beside one carcass, quieter than I'd seen her the entire morning. Past the carcasses, snagged on exposed rebar near the reinforced entrance, I found a strip of nylon webbing, faded orange, the kind used on ultra-light backpacking gear rather than anything a poacher would carry. Cass recognized the brand before I did, said it matched exactly what volunteers had described from Journey Aldrich's known gear list during the initial search effort, and something in her voice went thinner saying it than it had all morning. Voices carried out from inside the adit then, low, unhurried, the particular ease of men who had no reason yet to expect company this deep into land they clearly considered fully their own. Cass grabbed my sleeve and pulled us both down in a brush at the clearing's edge, rifle coming up off her shoulder without any wasted motion. 30 years of handling wildlife emergencies, translating instantly into handling this one instead. Two men emerged from the adit's mouth, one carrying a headlamp still lit despite the daylight, the other dragging something on a tarp that neither of us let ourselves look at too directly. They loaded whatever it was onto a game cart identical to the one from Cass's camera footage, talking between themselves about a buyer's schedule in tones flat enough to make my skin crawl worse than anything overtly threatening could have managed, and started wheeling it down a spur road neither Cass nor I had noticed on any map of this tract. We waited until the cart and its two handlers disappeared around a bend before either of us moved. And even then Cass kept her voice to something barely above breath, said we needed to get this to actual authorities today, not tomorrow, that whatever we just watched loaded onto that cart wasn't an animal, and both of us knew it. I agreed, and we started backing out the way we'd come, careful with our footing on ground that seemed determined to snap every twig underfoot. We were maybe 200 yards from the boundary when a third man stepped out from behind a stand of hemlock ahead of us, rifle already leveled, older than the two we'd watched leave, weathered in a way that spoke to decades on this exact mountain, rather than anything temporary. He didn't look surprised to find us there so much as irritated, the particular irritation of a man interrupted mid-routine by a problem he now had to solve personally. He introduced himself, with an unsettling politeness, as Garrick Loomis, said his family had worked this tract for 3 generations across mining and timber both, said the operation currently running through those adits had simply been the most profitable use he'd found for land that stopped paying for itself decades back when the iron played out. He said it like a man justifying a business decision to unimpressed shareholders rather than 2 people who'd just watch him disappear a human body on a game card. He marched us at gunpoint back toward the adit, and inside, past the reinforced entrance, the tunnel opened into a series of chambers cut and shored decades ago, now repurposed with processing tables, coolers, vacuum sealing equipment, everything organized with the same grim efficiency I'd have expected from a legitimate wildlife necropsy lab rather than whatever this actually was. Cass's face, taking it in, had gone the color of old ash. In a side chamber, secured to a support post with the same insulated cable I recognized from other industrial uses, I found Journey Aldrich, alive, considerably thinner than any thru-hiker photo would suggest, blinking against our headlamps like she'd stopped fully expecting anyone to come looking. She didn't speak right away, just made a sound low in her throat, relief and terror tangled too close together to separate cleanly. Loomis explained, still maintaining that unnerving calm, that Journey had wandered off trail chasing a water source 3 weeks back and stumbled directly onto a bait site his men were tending, panicked at what she saw, and gotten herself detained rather than eliminated only because his operation, whatever else it was, apparently balked at killing someone outright, when keeping her quiet seemed like it might work instead. He said this like it reflected well on him. I didn't trust myself to respond to that. He left us under guard of the younger of his 2 men while he dealt with something elsewhere in the tunnel system, and I recognized in that younger guard's fidgeting the same nervous tell I'd have looked for in a spooked animal. Shifting weight, eyes checking the exit more than checking us, the behavior of someone in over his head rather than someone fully committed to whatever Loomis had built here. Cass caught the same read I had, and between us we started talking, quiet and steady, asking him about his family, whether this was really the life he'd pictured, working the same patient angle you'd use gentling a wild animal too scared to be handled directly. It took the better part of an hour, but his attention slipped enough, distracted by a radio call from deeper in the tunnels, that I got a hand on the cable securing Journey's wrists and started working it loose with fingers gone clumsy from cold and adrenaline both. Cass moved on the guard the instant his focus broke fully, faster than I expected from a woman her age, and the 2 of them went down hard together, her forearm locked against his throat with the same unhesitating competence she probably used tranquilizing bears twice her weight. I got the cable free, hauled Journey upright, her legs barely holding her own weight after 3 weeks of captivity, and the 3 of us moved for the tunnel mouth before either of us had fully processed what we'd just done. We hit daylight and kept moving, Cass leading since she knew this track's terrain better than any map either of us had. Angling away from the spur road, Loomis's men had wheeled that cart down and instead cutting cross slope through undergrowth thick enough to slow us, but hopefully slow anyone chasing us worse. Journey stumbled twice in the first quarter mile, and both times some reserve neither Cass nor I knew we had kept her upright, and moving rather than let her go down. Shouting rose behind us within minutes. Loomis's voice among it, considerably less composed now than it had been explaining his business model minutes earlier. A shot cracked somewhere off to our right, wide of us by a margin that felt more like warning than accuracy, and Cass returned fire once over her shoulder without breaking stride, buying us a few seconds of hesitation from whoever had taken that first shot. We crossed a dry creek bed that Cass swore led toward a legal trailhead if we followed it far enough downhill, and for a stretch the terrain worked in our favor, steep enough to slow pursuit, but familiar enough to Cass that she never once hesitated on direction. Journey found enough strength somewhere to half run rather than be fully dragged. Adrenaline, apparently doing for her what 3 weeks of captivity clearly hadn't allowed her body to recover on its own. A light swept close through the trees above us at one point, and Cass pulled us both down hard behind a boulder shelf. All three of us pressed flat and silent, while voices passed close enough that I could make out individual words for the first time since the tunnel. Someone reporting no visual. Someone else redirecting search toward the ridge instead of the creek bed we currently occupied. We waited long minutes after the voices faded before daring to move again. The dry creek bed eventually widened into an actual trail, blazed white in a pattern I recognized, even in my exhausted state, as Appalachian Trail marking, and Cass confirmed it led, a mile or so further, to a shelter she knew stayed stocked with a satellite messenger for exactly this kind of backcountry emergency. We pushed the last stretch on legs and lungs while past complaint, Journey between us now, an arm slung over each of her shoulders. The shelter, when we reached it, sat empty of other hikers, but held exactly what Cass had promised, a battered satellite communicator chained inconspicuously to a support post for shelter maintenance use. I fumbled through sending an emergency message with hands still shaking hard enough to mistype twice, while Cass kept watch on the trail behind us, rifle steady across her knees despite everything her 65 years had just put her through. We waited there for what felt considerably longer than the 2 hours it actually took, Journey drifting in and out of something between sleep and shock against my shoulder, until the thump of a helicopter finally broke the ridge quiet from somewhere south of us, and Cass, watching it approach, said something under her breath that sounded less like relief and more like disbelief that any of us had actually made it this far intact. The helicopter set Journey and me down at a hospital in Johnson City before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, Cass insisting on riding in a state police vehicle instead so she could lead them straight back to the site rather than let it go cold while paperwork caught up to urgency. I gave my first statement, still wearing the same mud-caked clothes from the tunnel, an officer taking notes with an expression that shifted, sentence by sentence, from routine to genuinely alarmed. Federal wildlife enforcement got looped in faster than I expected, a woman named Agent Pruitt arriving within hours, explaining with tired familiarity that organized bear poaching rings have been a known problem across the southern Appalachians for years, chronically under-resourced relative to the scale of the trade, and that a tip this concrete, tied to an actual missing person case, would finally justify the kind of raid her office had been requesting funding for since before I'd ever set foot in Unicoi County. The raid happened that same night, a coordinated response considerably larger than anything Cass's year of persistent, unanswered reports had ever managed to summon on their own. I wasn't there for it, still under observation at the hospital for exposure, and a knee I'd wrenched somewhere during the run I hadn't even noticed hurting until the adrenaline wore off, but Agent Pruitt briefed me the following morning on what they'd found. They'd taken Garrick Loomis into custody without incident, along with the 2 men from the camera footage, processing equipment, and a walk-in freezer's worth of evidence seized from the attic chambers, enough to build what Pruitt called one of the more significant wildlife trafficking cases her office had pursued in a decade. What they hadn't found was the younger guard Cass had subdued in the tunnel, who'd apparently slipped custody sometime during the chaos of the raid itself. That detail sat wrong with me longer than I expected, a loose thread in what should have felt like a clean resolution. Pruitt assured me a manhunt was underway, that rural terrain this size swallowed fugitives only temporarily, usually, and that his name and description had already gone out to every agency with jurisdiction anywhere near these mountains. I wanted to believe her more fully than I actually managed. Journey recovered under observation 2 floors up from mine, and I visited once before either of us got discharged. Found her quieter than I expected, unwilling yet to talk in much detail about the 3 weeks between her disappearance and our finding her, though she thanked me in a voice still hollowed out by whatever that captivity had cost her beyond the physical. I told her she didn't owe me any explanation. She nodded like she appreciated not being asked for one. Cass came by my room the day before I was discharged, moving stiffer than she had on the mountain. Said the state wildlife agency had finally, belatedly, committed real resources to investigating the broader poaching network Loomis's operation appeared connected to. Said it felt less like vindication and more like exhaustion finally paying off after a year nobody wanted to listen to her. I told her the release-ready bear, still in her care back home, had better be doing fine. She managed something close to a laugh at that. I gave my final statement to state investigators 3 days after the raid. My professional background apparently useful enough to the case that they asked me to consult on identifying additional carcass sites from photographs recovered at the tunnel complex. I did it because it felt like the only thing left I could actually offer, sitting in a conference room matching gallbladder counts to a trafficking network's likely scope while trying not to think too hard about the loose guards still somewhere out on that mountain. I finished my clinic circuit a week later than scheduled, working through the backlog of barn calls that had piled up while I sat in hospital beds and conference rooms instead of vaccinating hunting dogs and spaying barn cats. Oaks met me at the first rescheduled farm, quieter than usual. Said his uncle had told him enough of what happened that he didn't need the full version, and I appreciated him not asking for it anyway. The manhunt for the missing guard dragged on past my own departure from the county, updates trickling to me secondhand through Agent Pruitt's occasional check-ins, mostly to confirm details for the growing case file rather than to share good news. 3 weeks after the raid, they found him, considerably further south than anyone expected, attempting to cross into Georgia on foot along a stretch of it he apparently knew well enough to think it offered better cover than any road. Pruitt told me, once his capture made it into the broader case update, that he'd given a full statement implicating Loomis in considerably more than the wildlife trafficking charges already filed, including at least one earlier disappearance predating Journey Aldrich's by nearly 2 years, a case that had gone cold enough nobody had connected it to this operation until his statement forced the reevaluation. I didn't ask for the dead hiker's name. I didn't think I could carry it well. The case against Loomis, once fully built, stretched considerably wider than the single tract of mining land where Cass and I had stumbled into it, implicating buyers and distribution contacts across 3 states. Evidence of a trafficking network that had apparently operated with minimal disruption for the better part of a decade before one missing hiker and one persistent wildlife rehabber finally forced it into daylight. I testified eventually, months later, in a proceeding that felt considerably less dramatic than the actual events it addressed, mostly technical questions about camera footage timestamps and carcass documentation. My professional credentials apparently useful to prosecutors in ways my actual terror on that mountain never fully translated into courtroom language. Loomis's expression through all of it stayed as unnervingly composed as it had been marching us into that tunnel at gunpoint. Journey didn't testify in person, gave a recorded deposition instead, and I heard through Pruitt that she'd left the trail entirely after her recovery, abandoned the through hike less than 200 miles from a finish she'd apparently trained 2 years for. I understood that decision without needing it explained to me. Some places don't get to keep being just a trail once you've survived something like this on top of one. Cass's bear population study, one state resources actually backed it properly, documented a decline steeper than even she had estimated during our first conversation. Enough that the state committed to a multi-year enforcement initiative specifically targeting poaching activity across the broader Cherokee National Forest region. She sent me an update card 6 months later, said the release-ready bear I'd asked about had gone back to the wild successfully, said it like the one unambiguously good outcome either of us had earned from the whole ordeal. I kept running my mobile clinic circuit through Unicoi County after that, though I stopped parking overnight anywhere near Buck Mountain's old boundary lines. Told myself it was just convenience rather than admit the actual reason. Some nights, wherever my circuit puts me, I still catch myself listening for an engine running dark on a gravel spur that has no business carrying traffic that late, and more nights than I'd like to admit, some part of me is still braced to hear it. It's been the better part of a year now since that October, and I still think about the mountain more than I'd have expected given how thoroughly the case eventually closed. Loomis took a plea rather than risk trial. Enough charges stacked against him that even his lawyers apparently advised against gambling on a jury. He'll be an old man, if he lives that long, before he sees anything resembling freedom again, which felt like justice the day I heard it, and feels like something smaller and more complicated most days since. Cass and I still talk every few months, mostly about bears now rather than anything darker. Her rehab operation expanded with grant funding that came, bitterly, only after the case made regional news loud enough to embarrass the agencies that had ignored her reports for a year beforehand. She sent photos last spring of 2 cubs she'd raised from orphan rescues, released healthy back on a land that state enforcement now actually patrols the way it always should have. I ran into Oaks again this past summer, back for another season of clinic work, and he mentioned, careful in a way that told me he'd been waiting for the right moment, that his uncle still won't hike anywhere near Buck Mountain even now. Years of enforcement presence apparently not enough to undo whatever that year cost or personally beyond the physical danger either of us actually faced inside that tunnel. Journey and I exchanged messages a handful of times after her deposition, mostly logistics at first, then something warmer once enough time had passed that neither of us needed to perform recovery for the other's benefit. She's working a desk job now, she told me, somewhere landlocked and nowhere near a trailhead. Said she thinks about finishing the sometimes and mostly decides she doesn't need to prove anything to herself that badly anymore. The younger guard who slipped custody during the raid, the one whose eventual capture cracked open the case's full scope, took a cooperation deal that got him a considerably lighter sentence than Loomis or the others, a detail that sat uneasily with me for a long while until Pruitt reminded me, not unkindly, that his statement was the reason an earlier victim's disappearance finally got answered at all. However incomplete that answer turned out to be. I still don't know that earlier victim's name. Pruitt told me once that the family had asked for privacy through the proceedings, and I've respected that even in my own head, even now, telling myself it isn't mine to carry the way, I've let myself carry pieces of Journey's ordeal and Cass's exhaustion instead. Some griefs aren't ours to hold regardless of how close we came to the ground they're buried in. I drove past the trailhead nearest Buck Mountain once more this past October, a full year out from everything, mostly to prove to myself I still could without my chest doing the thing it used to do driving anywhere near that boundary. The gate was newer, official signage posted where Loomis's laminated warnings used to hang, state vehicles visible at a ranger checkpoint that hadn't existed the year before. It looked from the road like an ordinary piece of protected forest finally being protected the way the label always claimed. I didn't get out of my van. I sat there a few minutes with the engine running, humming something under my breath without fully noticing I'd started, the same old bluegrass tune my grandmother used to sing. And then I put the van back in gear and kept driving my circuit because that's what I do, and because some mountains you visit once at that particular cost, and then you let the rest of your life be the thing that carries you forward instead of back. My name is Sims Okafor. I'm 38. And I spent 12 years as a long-haul trucker before switching to something steadier, running equipment logistics for a small outfit that services ski resorts in the off-season. It's less driving, more paperwork, but it still gets me out to corners of the map most people never see, which is the part of the old job I never want to give up entirely. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, city kid through and through, and I still get a kick out of how different rural Vermont feels from anywhere I came up. I like the quiet. I like that nobody out here needs anything from me beyond doing my job competently and leaving when I'm done. After a divorce that ate up most of my 30s in arguments about whose turn it was to want what, quiet started feeling less like absence and more like relief. The contract that brought me out this time was a delivery run to a resort maintenance yard outside a town small enough that its name didn't show up on my truck's GPS, tucked in a hill country in the Green Mountains' northern reaches. Mid-October, leaves past peak and starting to thin, cold enough at night that I ran the heater in my cab longer than the calendar said I should need to. The flyer was taped to the door of the general store where I stopped for coffee, curled at the edges like it had been there through at least one rainstorm. A man's face, late 20s, camper van enthusiast according to the caption. Last seen 3 weeks back after telling a friend he planned to explore some old logging roads off the main route through the hills. Search called off after 12 days. The flyer noted, in print smaller than the rest. I asked the woman behind the register about it, mostly to make conversation while she rang up my coffee. She got quiet in the particular way people do when a subject makes them uncomfortable but not surprised. Said his name was Dashiell Reyes, Said this wasn't the first person to disappear off those particular logging roads. Said it like something she'd rather not have said at all. I pushed, gently, the way you do when someone's reluctance feels like it's covering for something bigger than simple town gossip. She told me, choosing her words slow, that a family had bought up a big stretch of old timberland back in the 90s, kept mostly to themselves, didn't take kindly to hikers or hunters wandering onto what they consider their property, even where the boundary line said otherwise. She didn't say more than that, glanced toward the door like she'd already said too much, and I let it drop, paid for my coffee, and told myself it was none of my business anyway. That night, parked at a pull-off along the delivery route waiting on an early morning yard opening, I heard something that didn't fit the quiet I'd been enjoying. A generator, distant but steady, running somewhere in hill country that should have had nothing on it but trees. I told myself it was nothing, a hunting camp maybe, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, headlights swept briefly across a ridge above my pull-off, moving slow along a route no official road should have run, visible for only a few seconds before the hill blocked the view again. I lay awake a long while after that, telling myself it didn't mean anything, and not quite managing to believe it. Morning brought me to the maintenance yard on schedule, cargo unloaded, and paperwork signed by a supervisor named Pernell Hoyt, who ran the resort's off-season operations with the tired efficiency of a man who'd rather be doing anything else. He was easy enough to talk to once the work part was done, and when I mentioned the flyer and the family the store clerk had hinted at, his easy manner dropped fast. He confirmed there was a family, the Garlands, who owned a substantial chunk of the old logging tracts, said they'd been out there 3 generations now, increasingly isolated with each one, barely seen in town except for supply runs. He said local rumor had it they'd built something considerably more elaborate than a normal homestead back in those hills, though nobody he knew had actually seen it firsthand. I asked if he thought that had anything to do with Dashiell Reyes going missing. Pernell's answer was careful, non-committal, the answer of a man who suspected plenty and had decided years ago it wasn't his business to suspect it out loud. He said 2 other people had gone missing off that same stretch of road over the past decade. Both cases eventually closed as probable accidents, neither ever actually found. That evening, with a full day before my next scheduled pickup, curiosity got the better of judgment. I usually trusted more. I drove the main route past where the flyer said Dashiell had last been seen, parked at a wide shoulder, and started walking one of the old logging roads on foot, telling myself I only meant to look at the terrain, nothing more. The road climbed steadily through second-growth timber, degraded enough in places that my boots sank into soft, waterlogged ground. About a mile in, I found a gate, chain link, newer than the surrounding rust would suggest was original, a laminated no trespassing sign zip-tied on at an angle that looked recently adjusted rather than weathered into place over years. Past the gate, visible only because I climbed over rather than turned back, the road continued toward a cluster of structures further up the hillside, glimpsed briefly through gaps in the tree line. Several buildings, more organized than any homestead I'd expect, solar panels catching the last of the daylight on one rooftop, a water tower rising incongruous above the canopy. I didn't go closer that first evening, some instinct telling me daylight and unfamiliar ground made for a bad combination if anyone up there decided to object to my presence. I backed out the way I'd come, marked the gate's coordinates on my phone, and told myself I'd report it to somebody official once I figured out who that somebody should be. That night, back at my pull-off, the generator hum returned, joined this time by something that took me longer to place. A dog, or several, barking in a pattern too rhythmic to be random, more like a signal than an alarm. I lay in my cab along while listening, and somewhere past midnight, convinced myself the sound had moved considerably closer to my position than it had any reason to be. I should have driven off that night. I've replayed that decision more times since than I care to admit. Instead, telling myself I was simply curious about whatever compound sat up that hillside, I hiked back to the gate at first light, gambling that early morning meant less activity and better odds of a look around before anyone noticed. The compound, once I got close enough to actually see it, was larger and more organized than the glimpse the evening before had suggested. A half-dozen structures, a fenced garden plot, what looked like a small livestock pen, everything arranged with the deliberate permanence of people who'd built to last rather than to hide temporarily. It didn't look abandoned. It looked lived in, maintained, considerably more self-sufficient than any homestead I'd have expected this deep in hill country. I worked my way along the tree line rather than approach directly, some instinct insisting that whatever this family had built, it wasn't built to welcome visitors. Near the garden fence, half buried in soft ground, I found a boot, weathered enough to have been there weeks rather than days, and beside it, a strip of fabric caught on the fence wire that matched, uncomfortably, the description of clothing from Dashiell's flyer. Voices reached me before I saw anyone. Two men, unhurried, discussing something about perimeter checks in a tone that suggested routine rather than urgency. I dropped low into brush of the tree line's edge, breath gone careful and shallow, watching two figures in matching dark canvas jackets walk a fence line with the easy authority of men checking property they considered fully their own. One of them carried a rifle slung casual as a tool rather than a weapon, and something about the way he scanned the tree line, methodical, practiced, told me this wasn't the first perimeter check he'd run and wouldn't be his last. I stayed flat until they passed, their conversation fading toward the compound's far side, and only then let myself breathe fully again. Past the garden, closer to the largest structure, I spotted something that turned my unease into something considerably sharper. A line of vehicles parked behind a low outbuilding, among them a camper van matching, in color and build, the description from Dashiell's flyer, parked like it had simply been absorbed into the compound's own fleet rather than hidden away. I photographed what I could from cover, hands steadier than I expected given how loud my own pulse had gotten, and started working my way back toward the gate, telling myself I had enough now to bring to actual authorities, that pushing further would only get me exactly the kind of attention I couldn't afford. I made it nearly to the gate before a voice behind me, calm and entirely too close, told me to stop right where I was and turn around slow. And I understood, turning to find a third man I hadn't accounted for standing between me and the only way out I knew, that whatever careful plan I'd had for leaving quietly had just stopped being an option. The man who'd caught me looked younger than the two I'd watched on the fence line, maybe mid-20s, rifle held with a steadiness that told me he'd trained with it plenty even if he hadn't necessarily used it in anger yet. He walked me back toward the compound rather than toward any authority I recognized, talking the whole way in a tone that unsettled me more than hostility would have. Calm, almost bureaucratic, like processing trespassers was simply part of his job. He brought me to the largest structure, where an older man introduced himself as Garland Sr. with the polite formality of someone hosting an unexpected guest rather than holding one at gunpoint. He explained, unprompted, that his family had built this place over 3 generations specifically to be left alone, said outsiders occasionally wandered too close, said most of them eventually agreed to stay rather than risk word getting out about a community that valued its privacy this highly. The word stay landed harder than anything else he'd said, and looking past him toward a fenced structure at the compound's edge, I understood with a cold, sinking clarity that Dashiell Reyes hadn't been killed and buried the way I'd half expected. He'd been kept, along with, I now suspected, whoever the other 2 disappearances over the past decade had actually been. They walked me to that structure, more shed than shelter, secured with a padlock. Garland Sr. worked himself with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd done this before. Inside, in dim light filtering through a single grimy window, I found Dashiell, thinner than his photo, along with a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself, voice cracked from disuse, as someone reported missing from a neighboring county nearly 2 years back. Garland Sr. explained, still conversational, that I had a choice most guests apparently weren't offered directly: join the community properly, contribute skills. In exchange for safety and purpose he claimed the outside world couldn't offer, or continue being what he called a guest indefinitely while I reconsidered. He said it like a genuine kindness, and something in his sincerity scared me worse than open hostility would have. I told him what he wanted to hear, bought myself time the way you learn to in any situation where the only weapon you have left is patience. Over the following hours, as he left us under guard of the younger man from the fence line, I worked the same angle I'd have used talking down anyone in crisis. Quiet, careful conversation, asking about his life, his family, anything that let his guard slip incrementally instead of all at once. It took until near dark, the guard's attention finally slipping enough checking something on a radio, before I moved. The struggle was fast and ugly, ending with me holding a rifle I never wanted in both Dashiell and the other woman freed from the shed's padlock chain. All three of us moving as fast as our weakened legs and as exhaustion would allow toward the tree line and whatever direction led away from Garland Sr.'s calm, terrible hospitality. We didn't make it cleanly. Shouts rose behind us within minutes. The compound's small population mobilizing with a speed that told me they drilled for exactly this scenario more than once before. Gunfire cracked somewhere off to our right, close enough to send bark spraying from a trunk just ahead, and I put myself between the shots and the two people I was half carrying rather than think too hard about whether that was actually the smart position to take. We hit the gate considerably faster than I'd covered that ground going in, adrenaline carrying all three of us past whatever reserves we should have run out of an hour earlier. My truck was still where I'd left it at the shoulder, and I got both of them into the cab, gunned the engine, and put miles of switchback row between us and that hillside before any of us managed a full sentence about what had just happened. I drove straight to the nearest state police barracks rather than risk any local channel that might, for all I knew, run back to people sympathetic to the Garlands. The response, once officers understood what I was describing, came fast and heavy. State units first, federal agencies trailing within the day for a case that had apparently been quietly troubling investigators for longer than the official record suggested. Dashiell and the other woman, whose name turned out to be Priscilla Van Twest, went by ambulance to a hospital 2 counties over, weakened but alive, which felt, watching those doors close, like the only outcome that had ever really mattered through the whole ordeal. I gave statements for the better part of 3 days, the stories sounding less believable with each retelling despite being, if anything, simpler than what I'd actually lived through. A raid on the compound 2 days later found it largely emptied, structures intact but abandoned in a hurry, vehicles gone including, notably, the camper van I'd photographed. Garland Sr. and the others were never located, the family's decades of careful isolation apparently extending to an exit plan as thorough as everything else they'd built. The official statement, once regional news picked it up, described a self-sufficient compound linked to multiple unsolved disappearances, investigation ongoing, no arrests made despite considerable evidence. Purnell's rumors about the Garlands' increasing isolation went unmentioned in anything official, filed away. I assumed, as local color that had this once turned out to have a considerably darker foundation than anyone in town had wanted to examine closely. Dashiell reached out once, months later, mostly to thank me before going quiet the way people do when they'd rather not be reminded of their worst weeks. I finished my contract route eventually, though I stick to daylight stops and well-marked roads now, and I still catch myself, more nights than I'd like to admit, checking any distant hillside for lights that shouldn't be there, listening for a generator hum that has no business reaching as far as wherever I've decided, that night, to park.